There were people of all kinds and all organizations, of every rank from the lowest to the most exalted, all jostling for space upon the ship. Gilliman's departure date was only a few months away. Preparations were well underway, and as time ran out, activity increased. The void around the ship was as busy as its halls, with hundreds of craft passing to the flagship every day. Arios passed through the crowds in wonderment. In the days before Call had taken him in, he had never seen such a variety of people. The gangs in his hive distinguished themselves by mark and costume that, at the time, had seemed vibrant and diverse. He realized how limited their self-expression was, and how similar they had all looked. In the dawn of fire, Arios was confronted by humanity in all its varied forms, and despite his psychological conditioning, it made his head ring. Battle programming vied with culture shock for his attention, alternately presenting him with a long list of threats and a sense of numb amazement. Messenius seemed immune to it all, and Arios struggled to keep up with his captain as he pushed through the crowds like a ship forcing passage through ice. It all felt like a dream. He half believed he would wake in a warm, hidden corner of the Dana 50. He feared he would come round on Call's examination tables and suffer the unshakable cold of his millennial hibernation again. Only the endless training exercises run through his half-dormant brain seemed real. The Xenos and fiends he had fought over and over again were vivid to him, but all that had happened since he had awoken was like a vid feed, a perfect recording of something that had happened to someone else, distant and unreal. He tried to shake it off. A little clarity was his reward every now and then, but true consciousness slipped from his fingers like smoke, refusing to be grasped. His training seemed to pilot him, with his consciousness a mere passenger in his new body. He was a ghost, trapped in his still-living corpse, like the elders of the Dana 50 said happened to dishonored fighters. He could be one of them, the half-dead. He had thought it before, and he thought it now. This was the hell of his people. Totvan told him it would improve. He reassured Arios that he had felt that way himself. "The way to live," he said, "is to live. It is simple. Take experience firmly and wring every sensation from it. Trust me, the dislocation passes. You will feel part of the world again soon." He wished it would pass sooner. He and Messenius walked through the press of people so tightly packed he had to be careful not to harm the mortals, for they brushed him always, and at the worst choke points pressed hard against his battle plate. He could have moved through them as easily as wading through water, if he so chose, but at the cost of leaving a trail of broken limbs and mashed flesh. He lacked Messenius' skill at negotiating the crowds. He felt clumsy. There were soldiers everywhere, Adeptus Astartes of old and new sorts, thousands of mortal troopers from the Navis Imperialis and the Astra Militarum, and agents from every warlike adepta. At crucial junctures of the ship, the golden auramite of the custodians flashed. Checkpoint after checkpoint had to be passed. There was no direct route to the Primarch's command center. Before proceeding from the landing bay, they had been obliged to give up their weapons. Although he had had the guiding hand in creating these precautions, Messenius was impatient. His rank and status granted them access through every barrier and guarded door, but it was slow going. The ship trains were packed to capacity, and their transmotive engines hummed with the effort of pulling so many heavy cars. Cargo was everywhere, being delivered directly from the ship's loading hangars to its destinations, and conveyors jammed all the major thoroughfares. After an hour, the Space Marines reached the command deck. There things were hardly less frantic. Tech priests and tech marines had taken apart large parts of the structure, upgrading equipment in so many places that the deck looked like it was under construction. Artisans on scaffolding added new decorations to the pillars and vaulting, while a small procession of Ministorum priests went about, loudly blessing everyone and everything. They were met by Germain Gunther, one of Gilliman's senior logisters, and taken through to the Grand Strategium, situated aft of the main command deck. Several smaller rooms had been removed to accommodate this new facility, a large sphere with hundreds of stations rising halfway up the lower portion, each equipped with cogitators and multiple displays. Banks of hololith projectors filled the upper half, their thousands of focusing lenses gleaming in the half-light. Alone of all the places on the ship, the Strategium was finished and quiet. It was also free from all ostentation and decorative flourish. By stepping into it, Arios felt he was going back into a cleaner, more effective age. Rabute Gilliman was upon a grav stage, currently docked and inactive, off to the side of the main imaging pit, where he consulted quietly with 3 men. Messenius and Arios stopped at a respectful distance until the Primarch was finished, and waited to be called forward. Even from a distance, the Primarch daunted Arios. He towered over his advisers, but his presence extended far beyond the physical, so that he seemed to fill the entire chamber. In Arios's mind, he appeared to grow, to become a titan trapped by his consent alone, who could at any time break through the walls of the ship and stride the stars, unfettered by technology. The Primarch turned to them, and the spell broke. The men left, hurried as everyone else aboard. "Vitrian," called the Primarch, beckoning with genuine warmth. "Come to me." The Space Marines crossed the strategium and joined Guilliman. Messinius gave a quick salute. Arios followed suit. The Primarch seemed to be a man now, one of uncommon charisma and size, but human nonetheless. Arios felt off balance. "My Lord Regent," said Messinius. He gestured to Arios. "My lieutenant, Ferran Arios." "Ah, it is good to meet you in the flesh, Ferran." Guilliman extended his hand. A palm as big as a power fist opened. Arios hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but enough to be noticed before taking it. The Primarch's hand engulfed his totally, and Arios experienced a brief, startling recollection of his birth father. "Be at ease, Ferran," said Guilliman. "I do not judge that which I have already judged worthy. You are a suitable man to wear the blue of Ultramar." Arios gave him a questioning look. "Your test records impressed me. It is I who appointed you as Vitrian's deputy." "Thank you, my lord," Arios managed to say. The sense of unreality receded, and now he was presented with the opposite problem. Rabute Guilliman seemed too real, a being from a place of solidity and noble fires, who stepped through the curtain to show life up for the shadowy dramaturgist sham that it was. "Arios," he said, "you have taken a new name?" "Brother Captain Messinius named me, at my request," said Arios. "My old life is gone, far into the past. It fades already. Ferran no longer seemed to fit." "We forget who we are at our peril," said Guilliman. "Equally, we should not cling to what is no more," said Arios. "But I keep my first name as a reminder." Guilliman smiled. It burned like the sun. "A man with a philosophical bent. Good. A Space Marine should be a thinker as well as a warrior." Guilliman regarded him long enough to make him uncomfortable. "A good choice," he said, speaking of the man and not the name. He released Arios's hand and returned his attention to Messinius. "Fleet Quintus is not ready," he said. "No, my lord," said Messinius. "The contagion is warp-tainted, and in the most severe cases brings forth infestations of minor Neverborn. The true extent of the problem has probably been concealed from Fleetmaster Pressorius, and the agency of the Officio Logisticarum curtailed. Without your order that I visit, the problem would have been hidden until it was too late. As it was, we visited one of the affected ships, and there were forced to engage a manifestation. No casualties. Quintus will not be ready to depart according to your schedule, and should not attempt to." "Temptation comes in many forms, and not only from the so-called gods," said Guilliman. "Men's desire for honor and gain have led them astray. Procurator Morbus Tafis has provided a thorough report. Your testimony is the final piece. They will not leave until the issue is dealt with." "Tafis implied the Inquisition should be called in." "Yes, I have ordered them to take control," said Guilliman. "Inquisitor Slivik of the Ordo Sepulturum is confident the contagion will be eradicated within a week, though drastic action is required. The affected ships have been taken to interplanetary space to be cleansed." He frowned a little, and sculpted wrinkles creased his statue's face. "This will cost us, in men and material. Van Lescas will be delighted, of course, although it concerns me the same motivations that turned this issue into a crisis are strong in her. Her strategic reasoning is sound." Guilliman looked at Arios. "You are to serve under Van Lescas. What do you know of her, Ferran?" "Very little, my lord." "She is a remarkable woman," Guilliman said. "Ferocious in battle and in politics. Of uncommon height for a mortal. She was born into the Vodine Sagaste command cadre, but she has the void in her blood. Her family line boasts generals, admirals, sector commanders, and links to 2 major rogue trader houses. By dint of centuries of careful marriage contracts, alliances, and mutual assistance accords, she can call upon several naval and Chartist dynasties. The name Van Lescas is already spoken with great respect across several sectors. Cassandra seems determined that it spread further." Guilliman's accent was curious. unlike any he had yet heard, an accent of time, not of place. "She is ambitious, then," said Arios. "Anyone can be ambitious. You are ambitious. You were lowborn, yet you aspired to rule what you could. It is what you do with ambition that counts. Ambition is a wild horse," said Gilliman. "But harnessed properly, it can pull a heavy load. Van Lescus is arrogant, overly confident, undiplomatic, and occasionally rude. However, she is brilliant, and one of the finest military minds currently alive. Her manner, while annoying to others, is effective. She gets things done, and we find ourselves at a time where many things need doing." Gilliman paused a moment. "In fact, let me show you, Arios. One day quite soon you will have responsibility for your own company of warriors, perhaps a chapter. Messenius will be there to guide you only so long. An understanding of our initial strategies will benefit you, if you are interested." "I am, my lord," Arios said. "It would be an honour." "Then we begin," said Gilliman. The grav platform rose up on quiet engines until it hovered 50 feet above the pit. It stilled, and the main hololith activated, projecting a light model of the galaxy 100 feet from side to side, 10 feet thick at the central bulge, only a foot deep through its spiral arms. The recreated light of 200 billion stars bathed them in an ethereal glow. Serpentine arms turned slowly about the barred heart. "This is our galaxy," Rabute Gilliman said. "Breathtaking, is it not? This is, alas, a reconstruction of how it should appear, were the warp to be absent." The image changed. Weeping sores of light appeared in several places, the largest above Terra's position, cutting the arm adjacent to Sol's own in half. A lesser spot manifested closer to the central mass. There were a few others, smaller, though no less sinister in aspect. "The Eye of Terror and the Maelstrom," said Gilliman, pointing to the two in turn. "The principal areas of materium-immaterium interface before the cicatrix maledictum opened. They are the relics of ancient disasters, tears in space that lead directly into the warp. They are ugly wheels on the face of creation, but far worse has taken their place. This is the galaxy now." The light changed. A slow purple stain spread across the image, extending outwards from pre-existing warp rifts at first, sending out creeping tendrils to each other, then more emerging from fresh wounds in the fabric of reality, all reaching for others, coming together until they formed a long venous cancer that cut reality in two, bending southwards at the eastern fringe of the Ultima Segmentum and curling back on itself where the stars thinned in the far galactic west. By far the broadest part of the Great Rift was around the galactic center, where millions of stars had been engulfed and terrible energies raged as reality and unreality tore at each other. The Eye of Terror to the north of Hydropore was incorporated as a large knot, the Maelstrom a hideous swelling coming off the galactic core. The rift was not a solid wall, but a gnarled thing with spurs that extended out in all directions, its surface undulating and uneven, cutting down through the galactic plane so that in some places it was taller than it was wide. Lesser wounds cut through space far from the main rift, and although the largest centered on known warp-real space interfaces, a number were entirely new. It was the heart of evil. Even looking at the rift as a light-spun projection made Arios uneasy. The northern part of the galaxy faded out, the objects there appended with data tags suggesting alternative configurations. "And so, the culmination of Abaddon's strategy of 10,000 years, said Gilliman. "The unpicking of the fabric of the tempus materium, and the unfettered intrusion of the warp, dividing our realm in two. Imperium Sanctus," he said, pointing to the southern element of the image. "Here the situation is dangerous but stable. The days of blindness have passed. We have regained contact with Imperial holdings. Astro-telepathic messages can be sent and received, and warp travel, though now more perilous than ever before, may be undertaken again. The light of the Astronomicon shines here. Sanctus is in peril, but not lost. To the relative north of the galaxy," he said, and his hand moved to indicate the faded part, "is Imperium Nihilus, and about that we know nothing. I do not know for certain whether anything remains beyond the warp storms, whether they are not a rift, but a solid wall behind which the warp itself is manifest to the galaxy's edge." "Do you think everything there is lost? What is most likely? Asked Arios. His home was behind that wall, and he felt a queasy tug in his guts at the thought. I do not think so. I have consulted the most experienced seers, astrogators, magi astra, and navigators in Sol, and I believe that the rift is a barrier, or perhaps more akin to a fissure. This cartolith represents that theoretical. It is speculative, but upon this speculation our strategy is based. We have to have a little hope. As we speak, torchbearer fleets head north to ascertain the truth of this supposition, and if proven, to find a way across. He passed his hand across the writhing energies. It is my belief that Abaddon has been working towards opening the rift since the fall of his gene-father, Horus. His 13 crusades appeared to be random. They were intended to bring about this cataclysm. A number of red dots spread across the galaxy, these purely representational graphics stark against the realistic starfield and rift. I have decided that the key to the enemy's success was Blackstone, said Gilliman, otherwise known as Noctolith, a substance that can be tuned to be in harmony with the warp or inimical to it. It has been long overlooked by the Imperium, but it appears that Abaddon was quicker to grasp its significance. Archmagos Belisarius Call and others have devoted much time to understanding how it functions. Perhaps, had we been faster to understand, then this would never have happened. He paused a moment. There were other species, though, who understood its power, and they exploited it. These red points are worlds where known concentrations of the substance is found, and these worlds are those with the xenostructures known as monoliths. The red-marked worlds blinked. Rings circled a number of them. Most were deep in the purple smear of the rift. The red lights winked off. The majority of the circled systems turned green. These green marks indicate pylon worlds attacked and destroyed by the War Master over the last 10 millennia. Note how they are concentrated in a line across the path of the rift. Then their destruction opened the rift, said Arios. Gilliman nodded. It has become clear that the pylons were in some way holding the power of the warp in check, and that without them it was free to spill out into reality, said Gilliman. Who would have known, in the days of the Great Crusade, how powerful and pervasive chaos was? Fairy tales and myths. His voice trailed off. Then he started anew. I assume that Abaddon's strategy follows one of two theoreticals. The first is that he has opened the rift in order to allow his patrons, never-born servants, easier access to our reality, cut our communications, hinder our means of travel, and isolate our worlds, as has indeed already happened. The warp is our lifeblood, as well as our poison. This trick was attempted before, long ago, by Horus when he attacked Terra, first with his ruin storm to hamper us, then with the opening of a rift within the bounds of Sol, to speed his demonic allies into the fight. If that is the case, then we are fighting a war with conventional aims, the gaining of territory, the usurpation of authority, and the subjugation of mankind to the will of the false warp gods with Abaddon as their puppet emperor. These were Horus's goals. What is the other possibility? Asked Arios. Throughout, Messinius kept quiet, being already party to this information. The other is more troubling, said Gilliman. He wishes to plunge all the galaxy into the warp, said Arios. Very good, Ferren, said Gilliman. I ask myself why. What would he gain from this? Reality in our galaxy would be destroyed, and perhaps it would be so weakened that it would spell the beginning of the end for the universe, not only our part of it. Could that truly be his aim? So I must question our theoretical. Why would any man wish to plunge all of existence into the warp? I do not understand the lure of these so-called deities. The power they offer is fleeting and corrupting, and therefore I cannot understand an enemy who courts them. However, understanding is irrelevant. Because I do not understand, it does not deny its existence. My theoretical stands as the worst-case scenario. Therefore, my practical must be to prepare for it. He gestured again at the cartolith. This projection begs a further question. Look at the line of the rift. If either are the War Master's objectives, then why open the cicatrix along that line? Why not take the rift right through Terra? Assuming the Emperor could not prevent that from happening. If we assume he could, then why not isolate the throne world in warp storms, as it was during the Age of Strife, before the Emperor rose? Indeed, we must ask ourselves why the pylons were where they were in the first place. He paused. Are either of you familiar with Archmagos Esotericus Sigillus Hestophan of Styges? No, said Arios. He looked at Messinius, who shook his head. He is one of the foremost experts on the warp and Blackstone in the Imperium, said Guilliman. The tech priests of Styges are famed for their knowledge of alien technologies, and Hestophan has dedicated several lifetimes to the study of Blackstone alone. It was he who first suggested its resonance with the warp, and later that it may be polarized to either carry or repel the energies of the Empyrean. Hestophan knows much about the interaction of the materium and the immaterium, and theorized that warp rifts form more easily in areas of high mass, he continued. In this case, I'm not speaking of the dangers associated with in-system warp translation, where high mass concentrations create gravitic rip that endangers ships emerging from the Empyrean. Guilliman pointed with his right hand into the cartolith. See here, the Eye of Terror centered on the ancient Eldari home cluster. This news he delivered as if it were a commonplace fact. Neither of the Space Marines were aware of it. An area of high mass, many stars, close together in a large globular group. Does that have bearing on that ancient race's fall? His finger moved down. The Maelstrom, hard by the limits of the galactic core, another area of high mass. Now, see the galactic core, which was largely free of the influence of the Imperium before the rift. It is swamped, said Arios. It is the area of the highest mass in the galaxy. Billions of stars, more closely packed than elsewhere, arranged in increasing tightness about the vortex at the center of the heavens, the galaxy's central black hole. It is there that the rift is largest and most violent. It is largely uncharted space. Who knows how many pylon worlds were there, destroyed by Abaddon while the Imperium slid into decline. So the pylons were placed where the veil between real and unreal might most easily be breached, said Arios. Along a line that takes in the denser parts of our galaxy. This is what you are saying, my lord. The breaking of the pylons opened up a fault line running from the Eye of Terror and through the galactic heart, unaided only by the great density of matter there. See how it follows the bar of the galactic heart and skirts the edges of the Perseus arm. Also note how many pylon worlds were sighted along the same arm. The fabric of our reality, the tempus materium, is not flat, but curved by matter. Where it curves deepest, it intrudes into the Empyrean, like a body floating on water, or weights resting on cloth. These concentrations allow our navigators to guide themselves out at the appropriate points of their journey. The Astronomicon is a lighthouse. These mass concentrations are the islands in the sea, the shores of the benighted ocean, the cliffs, bluffs, and distant mounts. But where the cloth bows, it is weaker. Now, said Guilliman. He waved his hand, and the cartolith shifted, zooming in on a portion northwest of Terra. Here is the Makorta Sound, the center of the Makorta sector, said Guilliman. It lies well south of the fault line that has become the Great Rift, but it too is an area of high mass. This nebula is a stellar phenomenon named the Corevrekan, and it has an unusual density at its middle. The Crusade of Slaughter is making its way towards Hydrofa through the Sound, bypassing the more direct route going via Mordax. The Mordax subsector is crawling with orcs, said Messinius. It has been, ever since the Forge World there fell. They could be avoiding it. Orcs are a minor inconvenience to the great enemy, said Guilliman. I surmise the presence of the greenskins has nothing to do with the Crusade's route. The mass present in the Makorta Sound twists space and time. Undermining the natural laws of our universe is easier here. By passing through the Sound, they will open reality to the warp more quickly. I will advance this projection. It is based on their current route, activity, and effect of whatever they have that is opening the materium to the warp. Watch what happens when the Slaughter Crusade hits the Corevrekan. The cartolith zoomed further into the Makorta Sound, showing a dense nebula alive with birthing stars. Dozens of suns packed around the fringes, lighting up the cloud like a lantern. The center turned slowly, trailing long flags of dust and gas, almost a miniature of the galaxy. Several of these tendrils were tipped with newly ignited suns. Further out, young stars shone dully through accretion disks, where infant planets were. A flicker passed across the nebula from top left to bottom right, spreading a smattering of green names across the simulated void. Cizeron, Fomor, Akieni, Humboldt's world, and several that suggested recent settlement, new landing, open prospect, far landing, and more, until 30 of the suns were bracketed in circles that denoted imperial ownership, and others bore lesser tags indicating imperial presence. A number of dark red arrows came in from the north, nosing down from the direction of the Eye of Terror. They spread out towards the northernmost worlds, and where they encountered imperial worlds, the signifiers changed. Far Landing was the first to go, winking out like a snuffed candle, its name greyed out. Others lasted longer. The names of some of them remained lit in doleful reds. As the red arrows spread, arrows in blue moved in from outside the sector, coming mostly from Hydrophor, to engage the red and reinforce the worlds. A couple of the smaller red arrows were extinguished. Many more blues were destroyed, or were turned black, diminished in size. More of the worlds were taken by the Crusade of Slaughter. The whole war was represented by symbols, but Arius could imagine the pain and suffering on each of the worlds that were overrun, and the terrible losses sustained. Following the Crusade came the purple smear of a warp rift. It was small at first, a sliver of unwelcome color, but it widened as it headed towards the nebula. It followed the red arrows as a carrion bird follows an army, passing over each conquered system, spreading its purple pall over them like the shadow of great wings. More text grayed out as worlds were swallowed by the warp. A pattern emerged. The rift was moving in towards the nebula at the center in a wide spiral, while red and blue arrows jabbed and split, encircled and retreated. Two small blue arrows headed towards the leading point of the rift. One turned back, another vanished. There was a convergence on the Fomor system, a gathering of arrows from all sides, then a repulsion of the blue. The Imperial forces fell back to the galactic southwest, where Hydrophor offered safe harbor. "We have passed the current moment," said Guilliman. "What follows is deduction." In the simulated future, the last of the green worlds were attacked and taken. The rift moved in closer and closer to the nebula, before piercing it like an arrow taking an eye. The nebula curdled. Purple light poured over the image, running out in all directions in a pattern like infected arteries carrying disease into a body, broadening towards the top, where, off the map, the great rift lurked. A long, jagged route surged downwards towards Hydrophor. The map zoomed out again, showing the rift spreading, spearing Hydrophor and curling in towards Terra. The rift in the Makorta sector fully joined to the Cicatrix Maledictum. Energized by connection to the larger warp storm, it raced ahead, coming within light years of the throne world, with hundreds of red arrows riding alongside. "Hold simulation," said Guilliman. The animation stopped. "The Crusade of Slaughter is a threat, but not to the whole Imperium. It is the nature of the Blood Gods' wars to burn themselves out, but this growing of the rift, that cannot be allowed to happen. It will grant Abaddon a road to the Sol system," he said. "We must assume this is among his primary strategic goals. Terra is at risk. Our initial strategy was to take the 8 key warp nexuses at the edges of the Segmentum Solar. With only Vorlesi currently in our hands, our crusade is effectively trapped. Quintus was supposed to leave soon to take Lysira, which will open the south. Tertius was to follow and secure the dead world of Olmec, giving us the west. Then I was to depart. Holding the warp gates is crucial to our securing of Imperium Sanctus. Only when Sanctus is safe can we think of venturing over the rift, if anything is still there. But the first phases of this strategy must be rethought." The cartolith vanished, plunging the strategium into gloom. Faint fires seemed to burn in the shadows of Guilliman's eye sockets. "The Crusade of Slaughter has to be stopped. Forces will move via the Vorlesi Gate and head from there to Hydrophor. The journey will be long. Tertius will have to rely on its own supplies until it reaches Hydrophor, and Olmec will have to wait. But I have decided." He looked at Arius and Messinius. "I am telling you this, as it affects you directly. Van Lescus will have her wish. Fleet Tertius departs first." Chapter 27. Precept Magnificat. The Warp Gate at Vorlesi. The route of Fleet Tertius. To immense fanfare, Fleet Tertius set sail from Terra's orbit. Van Lescas's flagship Precept Magnificat went first, breaking free of the orbital docks coddling it against the void's boundless dark, and pushing out as confident and impressive as its mistress. An Oberon-class battleship and one-time command vessel of Battlefleet Centaurus, the Precept Magnificat was a gargantuan blade of a ship, the ploughshare prow massing as much as a light cruiser alone. Although it was light on armament for its mass, most of its capacity was taken up by flight decks, and as a carrier, the Oberon class excelled. The Precept Magnificat had been modified extensively, fitting more hangars than usual for its type, so that it carried an impressive 10 squadrons of bombers, fighters, and assault boats. As Precept Magnificat departed its dock, these flew alongside in tight formation, the difference in size between the small craft and their giant carrier accentuating the flagship's immensity. For the Indomitus Crusade, the ship had been further modified. The superstructure was equipped with large amounts of strategic and communications equipment, much of it designed by Belisarius Cawl, while the prow bristled with auger arrays, enhancing its capabilities as a command vessel. The new equipment was either patterned after ancient, newly unearthed designs or on completely novel constructs pioneered by Cawl. The Archmagos's opponents accused him of hoarding ancient knowledge in the first instance, of dangerous innovation in the second, and of being a heretic for both. But the users of his bounty did not care for the quibbles of the cult Mechanicus. The new devices were smaller and better than those the ship had previously carried. Cawl had many enemies within his own faith, and there were increasingly violent calls by the more conservative congregations to condemn him as modus intolerabilis. The Imperial Navy, however, held him in high regard. For a Voidsman, a bigger gun and a better engine trumped most theological debate. What Cawl thought of all this, he kept to himself. Under displays of choreographed weapons fire and brilliant pyrotechnics, the Precept Magnificat set out, the vessels of her command coming into formation behind her. On those parts of Terra where order held sway, the priests of the Adeptus Ministorum urged worshippers to offer up their prayers for the fleet's success. Lips cracked and were bloodied by days of repeated hosannas sung for the glory of their god-emperor and his reborn son. Tech priest conclaves staged rituals, calling upon the machine god to ensure good function for all devices technologia, a titanic act of worship unseen in recent millennia. As the fleet sailed towards Mars, it absorbed a contingent of the Basilican Astra, and at its passing, the red planet went into a frenzy of ecstatic devotion that saw manufacturing output briefly rise by over 300%. Out into the dark, past the asteroids of the belt, hollowed by man in his first centuries in the void, out past Saturn, Jupiter, Neptune, and Uranus. As the Armada crossed the orbit of each of the planets, more vessels joined. The Jovian shipyards alone emptying a full 36th part of the Galilean lunar docks to swell the forces at Van Lescas's command. To avoid disrupting the flow of vessels into the Sol system, the fleet swept past the Elysian and Chthonic in-system gates, heading to the Mandeville Point Majoris beyond the heliopause, where the large aggregated mass of Fleet Tertius could safely enter the warp together, some 5 days sailing from Terra at the full speed of the slowest vessels. They made translation with little hardship. Null Maidens gathered from across the Imperium shielded the navigators of the largest ships in each battle group the fleet was subdivided into. Their presence pained the psychic navigators greatly, but reduced the risk to them from the warp, and with a little practice they were able to act as a screen to reduce the violence of the energies the navigators were exposed to. With the larger ships acting as shepherds to the smaller, Fleet Tertius forged on through the Immaterium towards the warp nexus at Vorlesi, travelling a major conduit that saw the fleet attain speeds not seen since before the rift had opened. Nightmares assailed the crew. Minor psychic manifestations were reported on scores of craft, as well as the usual suicides, eruptions of insanity, and other sorrowful happenings that accompanied warp travel. But there were no major breaches, and no losses of ships either to demonic incursion or navigational error. They made Vorlesi in good time. The vagaries of warp travel had only become more unpredictable after the rift, and timekeeping was nigh on impossible. But the ship's chronologians, aided by the secretive pair of operatives of the Ordo Kronos accompanying the fleet, were able to gauge the duration of their voyage at around 2.5 months, according to Vorlesi local time. They paused at the system's edge to give thanks to the Emperor, and bells rang from every chapel on every ship. The fleet rested at Vorlesi for just under 3 days. Several ships had sustained damage in the warp and were obliged to remain behind. More supplies were taken on board, though no further troops. Vorlesi had always been of strategic significance, but the upheavals of the Great Rift had shifted the major warp currents, and one nexus where many joined had come to rest under the skin of reality beneath the system, increasing its importance. Gilliman himself had prevented its destruction at the hand of the enemy, and Vorlesi was now being transformed into a bastion world, a rare gateway from which the forces of the Imperium could sally out. The changed courses of the stable currents that met at Vorlesi were still being mapped by the Astrocartographica and the more esoteric cartomancers of the navigator houses, but there was no indication that any would bear Tertius directly from Vorlesi's position at the eastern edge of the segmentum solar to the northwest, as their course required that they double back on themselves past Terra to the edge of the segmentum Pacificus and Hydrophor. Van Lescus spent all of their brief stay in close conference with her chief navigators and the highest-ranking Sisters of Silence. Hours passed in sometimes heated argument, generating the optimum route, which by necessity involved many shorter warp jumps and all the perils that entailed. Fleet Tertius departed as quickly as it had come, the ships of the Armada blotting out the stars of Vorlesi's night sky in their multitudes. Once out from Vorlesi, past the skeletal frames of the nascent star forts and the greater fleet guarding the space lanes, Fleet Tertius made its way to the further Mandeville point and passed back again into the warp. From there, the voyage became harder. Several more ships were lost. Incursions incurred on numerous vessels. Weeks later, they arrived. Chapter 28. Hydrophor, Ascendant Man, the Legacy of Cardinal Bukharis. Hydrophor turned, fat and dirty beneath the watchful gun arrays of the star fortress Ascendant Man. Around the long loop of the Gallery of Equilibrium, Inquisitor Rostov walked with Commodore Athagay, his small band of followers, and her command cadre. The walk was long, and the gallery was lined with troops all the way, each from different orders, from Astra Militarum regiments, Space Marine chapters, Battle Sister convents, Adeptus Mechanicus macroclades, and all the other branches of humanity's war machine. They ranged in form and type from standard humans who would have fitted into any era of mankind's history, to variants who skirted the heresy of mutation, grossly augmented cyborgs, and towering transhumans. But their purpose was the same, despite their differences in body form, armament, and uniform, and they all bore the mark of Fleet Tertius, proudly displayed. Fleet Mistress Cassandra Van Lescus was making a point, and Hydrophor was a world whose history was founded on making a point. Curving around the ventral signals array that jabbed at the planet below like an accusing finger, the Gallery of Equilibrium was a weakness in the station's formidable armor. Although it could be shut off in the event of attack, it presented a possible ingress to the fortress for boarders, thought Finula. The political value of the gallery outweighed its vulnerability, however. Hydrophor had long been a place where tensions between imperial factions were pressing. The elegant, bubble-shaped sections that made up the gallery's continuous viewing wall provided a necessary statement on the nature of imperial power. Hydrophor was a world divided. Above the final line of the atmosphere, the Navy held sway. Beneath it, the Adeptus Ministorum ruled the planet in uneasy conjunction with the Adeptus Mechanicus. Where the glowing gas attenuated to nothing, rows of orbital defenses stared at each other, those in the rarefied air covered in statues of saints and reliefs of miracles cast in plasteel, those in the true void rather more sober, decorated with eagles, engraved star charts, and honor scrolls listing important victories. The might of the battle fleet Pacificus was plain to see in the void, while the mega cathedra and manufactoria covering Hydrophor's surface were clearly visible from orbit. The reasons for the trinary division of power dated back to the age of apostasy, 4 millennia ago, and the world's shameful surrender to the forces of Cardinal Bukharis. But there was strategic wisdom in allowing this fractious arrangement to persist, as it kept any one organization from exerting control over the strategically vital system, and in microcosm of the balance of power between the major adepta throughout the Imperium, the three of them were stronger together than they would have been alone. Hydrophor was one of the great bastion worlds of the Imperium of Man, and hosted the chief naval base for all of Segmentum Pacificus. Its position close to the northern rim of the Segmentum Solar and the southern reaches of the Segmentum Obscurus meant its fleets were as often called to make war there as they were in their home segmentum, whose vast reaches extended far to the galactic south and west, where the halo stars made a thin border against the intergalactic void. Being close to the Eye of Terror, its ships had been at the forefront of the defense of Cadia for millennia, and its losses, when the Cadian Gate had fallen, had been severe. Still, Hydroforce stood. Assailed 3 times by chaos in recent months, its guns had not failed, not when darkness was cast like a shroud over the Astronomicon, nor when the rift had split the sky. Its fortresses had not been taken, its ships had not foundered. If one world had to be chosen to exemplify the Imperium, with its strength drawn from many parts, its indomitability, and its bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat in the face of overwhelming odds, Hydrofor was a good candidate. Fenula walked behind Rostov and Athagay. They didn't speak. Athagay wore complex war paint and a heavy costume whose train required 4 ratings to carry it. Rostov's armor was polished to a dazzling finish, his own red cape whispering over the shining floor next to Athagay's brocade. The commanders of strike group St. Asta wore their dress uniforms, every chest glinting with medals. The occasion was formal enough that Rostov's scruffy band of vagabonds had smartened themselves up, except the Xenos, who toddled along in its ragged cloak with an insolent look on its face, daring the assembled protectors of humanity to strike it down. Another point being made. Fenula hated politics, but she could not avoid them. They were an inevitable byproduct of human endeavor. Whether one loathed or enjoyed them, only a fool disdained them. Thousands of docking facilities radiated out from the planet in neat files, making long bands of metal stretching towards the stars. They were held in geosynchronous anchor on the same orbital plane as the equator, so that when viewed from above in full sunlight, Hydrofor resembled the jeweled orb of an alien king. Long runs of the facilities were physically joined together by power feeds and transit tubes, though not to the extent of the artificial rings around Luna or Mars. If they lacked the majesty of the solar shipyards, Hydrofor's docks competed with them in productivity, the sheer manufacturing output of Hydrofor's facilities outmatching all but a forge world. Hydrofor's near void was already full of ships when strike group St. Asta had sailed in from the night, a welcome reminder of the Imperium's strength. At Guilliman's order, various sector fleets had made their way to the world from segmentums Pacificus, Obscurus, and Solar to rally there. Others had headed for Hydrofor during the cataclysmic days following the rift, when the Astronomicon had failed, drawn in by the relay stations that ringed the 3rd moon of the 4th planet, upon whose surface a great temple of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica was sighted. To the scores of ships already present, Tertius had added hundreds. Their lights outshone the stars and competed with the system's sun. There were more battleships in one place than Fenula had seen in 2 decades of constant service combined, including marks of craft she had never seen before, alongside ships whose silhouettes were instantly recognizable. For among Fleet Tertius were storied vessels. Seeing what she saw surrounding Hydrofor, Fenula found herself believing that the Imperium could prevail, and that the ancient traitors could be driven back into the warp. The scale of Tertius was hard to take in, and the sight of it pushed the fearsome battle at Fomor 3 into the back of her mind. With the Crusade fleet, the battle would have been over in hours, and the world saved. Emperor, she thought, with Fleet Tertius with them, they could take all of the Makorta sector back in days. The parade was beginning to grate by the time they completed the full circuit. Fenula was never one for ceremony. It annoyed her as much as politics. More so, in fact, for although politics were necessary, ceremony rarely was. She'd seen people die because they'd stopped to perform their rituals. The gallery of equilibrium was long. Her dress boots were tight, and her feet ached well before the journey was over. But she kept her face neutral, as was expected, and walked with her back straight nevertheless. Eventually, the long walk was done. A funereal song coming from ahead announced that they had completed the walk.
"Priests!"
she heard the alien say. One of the men that accompanied Rostov, the smartly dressed one in the Astra Militarum lieutenant's uniform, not the slob in the crumpled fatigues, said something to the Xenos. His words were muttered, and she only heard the alien's reply.
"What?"
the repulsive thing said. Then it laughed, as if it were in a heathen marketplace and not surrounded by imperial warriors and imperial power.
"Yeah, I believe in gods. I just don't worship them. Gods are more trouble than they're worth."
The gallery branched, probably only a few hundred yards from where they had set out. Fenula guessed, for she could see once again the St. Asta and the rest of the fleet come from Fomor in the docks down towards the planet. Holy men stood in cowled throngs, thickening the atmospheric mix with incense. A fat bishop led their sermons from a legged motile pulpit whose heavenly sculptures were interspersed with weapon muzzles and glimmered with the steady shine of targeter lenses. A set of doors were
Construction
opened,
complete.
revealing another set behind, then a third as the second set was opened, then more. There were no more than a dozen yards between each, dividing the corridor into a series of vestibules, and the booming of the doors as they were flung back made a heavy percussion to the priest's singing. The air vibrated to hosannas and thanks to the Emperor and his holy son. They passed through several of these small spaces, variously dedicated to the Emperor, the saints of the Navy, the machine god, and lastly to the avenging sun. The final door was gargantuan, 40 feet high and nearly as broad. 20 freighters in white robes pushed to open them, and they swung inwards ponderously. Chandelier light flashed from a heavy relief that told, panel by panel, of the planet's shame and the Emperor's judgment upon it 4,000 years in the past. A huge hall awaited them. The emblems of dozens of imperial organizations hung from chains between tall pillars of a blue-veined stone. The chamber was circular, hundreds of feet high, the ceiling a giant dome in black that displayed the 7 key constellations of Pacificus as they were seen from Terra. The entire half-arc of the hall facing the doors was full of people displaying a dazzling array of uniforms and costumes, skin hues and morphologies. In the center of the crowd, a floating platform carried the chiefs of this host, space marines, generals, admirals, and at their front, Fleet Mistress Lady Cassandra Van Lescus. Rostov and Athagay's small
Anomaly
party
found.
came forward and halted in front of a line of richly garbed armsmen who were equipped more in the manner of Tempestus scions than simple naval troops. Athagay stuck out her hand from the side of her preposterous costume and waved Fionnuala forward, so she hurried to her mistress's side. The grav platform sank until it was a couple of feet off the ground. Steps at the front hinged down. Van Lescus walked briskly down them.
Inquisitor Rostov,
said Lady Van Lescus. She turned to Athagay with a rustle of fantastically pleated lace and layered silks. Her bionic eye whirred as it focused on the Commodore. Fionnuala had rarely seen one so fine. The false iris was as bright as sapphire, and the shining platinum that replaced Van Lescus's right brow and upper cheek was engraved at so fine a level it shimmered iridescently. It was jewelry when most other augmetics were ugly. She guessed that Van Lescus could have had a perfect biological mimic, but had chosen not to. She reeked of money and ancestral power.
you must be Commodore Athagay.
Van Lescus said. She held out her hand, not for it to be shaken, but to gesture at the Commodore, as if she might have difficulty recognizing that the Fleet Mistress referred to her. By the throne, Van Lescus was tall, almost freakishly so by baseline standards. She wasn't slight either, but firmly built, with well-toned muscles, wide shoulders, and little in the way of a waist. Her extravagant clothes made her appear even bigger, so that she filled all the space in one's field of vision, and crowded out those who stood in such multitudes behind her. Literally larger than life, she seemed. Her outfit was a jeweled one-piece bodysuit, tightly fitting around her hips, ankles, and wrists, flared and layered below the knee and at the shoulders. She wore a mass of delicate chains around her neck, and all her fingers bore fine rings engraved to match her augmetic plate's oily sheen. She wore a cap with a sharp peak like an avian bill, and long plumes either side of the head whose roots were black but progressed through all the colors of the rainbow until they were purest white at the tips. It was the kind of outfit that belonged to someone with an extensive wardrobe. Her face would have been ugly if seen in isolation, for it was heavy-set and unfeminine, but in the
Anomaly
context of
found.
Van Lescus, combined with her manner, height, attitude, but above all the overbearing confidence of the woman, it was fiercely beautiful. Athagay saluted stiffly. She was evidently uncomfortable in her dress uniform. Van Lescus watched her with some amusement, and Fionnuala felt Athagay prickle. There was going to be trouble between these two, she was certain of it. They were too similar, she thought. Both formidable, both tall, both strong. Women who would flatten anyone who came between them and their goal. But Van Lescus exceeded Athagay in all these categories. She was the Commodore taken to another level. The pink streaks in Athagay's hair seemed even more desperate compared to Van Lescus's easy flamboyance, and the Commodore's ceremonial uniform only accentuated her lack of flair, like a glorious frame drawing attention to the ordinariness of the picture it housed. Athagay was dressed up because she had to be. Her discomfort made her look ridiculous. Van Lescus looked like she wore clothes that gaudy every day, and she shone like a star because of it. Emperor help me, thought Fionnuala. They're going to detest each other. She could see it already in Eloise's face, annoyance gathering itself beneath her discomfort. Van Lescus was used to lording it over people.
Recon
She had
pass
that
completed.
air of nobility, of money and influence, 100 generations old, that expected to get what it wanted. Athagay had come up from the Schola Progenium, naturally brilliant but of no great background. She reacted badly to those born to rule. Her one great weakness, besides the stims, was envy of good blood. Thankfully, she was keeping quiet. This was Rostov and Van Lescus's affair. They were called to the fleet mistress's presence only because they had conveyed him to Hydrafer. Meeting her like this, without Admiral Trexon and the rest of Battlefleet Makota, was a borrowed honor. Fionnuala and Athagay were spectators. "You responded to my summons with admirable speed," said Rostov. "I thank you." He dipped his head a fraction, the sole deference he offered to the fleet mistress. Van Lescus laughed. Her teeth were like shaped pearls, very even and square. "I got your message, if that's what you mean, Inquisitor. Fleet Tertius was always intended to come here, although, thanks to you, we bypassed our original objective and came early. Be in no doubt, Lord Inquisitor, nobody summons me. It was my decision. I am a fleet mistress of the Indomitus Crusade. I answer only
Anomaly
to the Imperial
found.
Regent, Rabute Gilliman. Whereas I answer to the Emperor," said Rostov. "No one else." He moved his coat aside to show his inquisitorial seal attached to a loop on his breastplate by a ribbon. "I see," said Van Lescus. She looked a little displeased. She was not used to being spoken to that way. "Well then, this greeting here is probably a little lost on you, seeing as you answer to the highest power. I apologize if our attempts at appropriate levels of ceremony disappoint you." "I expected it," Rostov said, his voice so flat that Fionnuala couldn't guess whether he was offended or not. Rostov held up his hand and lifted his smallest finger. Upon it was a very fine ring. "This ring holds an alpha-level privacy field. It will prevent anyone hearing what we are going to discuss." "Now," said Van Lescus. "I have a feast waiting, you know." She raised her still human eyebrow. A line of gems were glued in place over it. "It can wait a quarter of an hour longer," he said. "In a moment, I will activate the field. I have news that I can give only to you, and it must be given immediately. I ask that you choose one witness to attend you while I speak, someone beyond reproach and entirely trustworthy, who will carry this information should you die." "I'm not going to die," she said, laughingly. "I've half a segmentum majoris's military at my back." "If the enemy learns what I know, they will expend all efforts to destroy you and me. It will set back your efforts here. They will do what they can to thwart us, and they can do anything.
Anomaly
All
found.
they have to do is find out. It is imperative this information is kept secret." "Very well," said Van Lescus. She turned and addressed an armored space marine in the livery of the white consuls upon the dais. "Mersenius, Gilliman trusts you. Come to my side." She crooked a finger at him. The platform shook as he came down to the floor, armor purring as he took up position opposite Athagay. "I myself will take the Commodore here,"
New
Rostov
sitrep.
said. "Only we four will know all the truth. That may be enough to allow us to act." Van Lescus evidently had a head for what was important and what was not. She set aside her offense, her expression entirely serious, and nodded. "Agreed." "First Lieutenant, this is not for your ears," said Rostov to Fionnuala. Not hard, not soft, a statement of fact. She was not to be included. Fionnuala withdrew to stand with the others in their small party. The Space Marine's unreadable eye lenses followed her. A shiver ran up her spine. She didn't like being that close to the Adeptus Astartes. "We will begin," said Rostov. The Inquisitor twisted his ring. The air around the quartet went fuzzy. They seemed to freeze, breaking up their outlines like those in a badly rasterized image. All sound ceased, replaced by a rushing noise, hard as solar interference on a vox. Fionnuala's vox bead squealed loudly, and she winced and disconnected it. Everyone else within 50 feet shut off their communications as the privacy field brutalized the vox. Fionnuala flexed her hands. Leather gloves creaked tightly around her knuckles, making her feel they would split, then her skin exposing the shine of bone beneath. Emperor, she was tense, helpless, excluded by those more powerful. It brought her a little comfort that many
New
faces in
sitrep.
Van Lescas's party mirrored her own. The little tableau of Massinius, Van Lescas, Athagay, and Rostov shivered. She wondered what would happen if she walked across the privacy field. She'd never seen one like that before. Nothing good, she decided. From behind her came a bored sigh and the sound of a heavy body settling onto the floor. Fionnuala turned around and saw the little Xenos, Chilka, arranging its robes around crossed legs and taking out a leather pouch.
What are you looking at? Don't you people know it's rude to stare?
It brought out some sort of foul-smelling ration steak from its bag and began to chew on it.
Stop gawping and make yourself comfortable,
It said through a full mouth.
We're probably going to have a long wait.
Chapter 29. Inquisitor Rostov's Errand.